Today's episode of Ideas Have Consequences is a little bit different than what we would normally do. What we are giving you today is a glimpse of the new Ideas Have Consequences book club. Now, the idea of the book club is, when we do something like a YouTube Live, I don't have the opportunity to engage you individually, and that is because there are just far too many people watching. The best we can do is pay attention to the chat and select a few random questions to which I might respond. But the Ideas Have Consequences book club is a little bit different. It is for members of the Posse. You join, and we keep it intimate, and I signed you a reading, and then we gather together and we discuss it. And I get to hear your comments, your questions, but I'm teaching you some key pieces of classical literature, and then some that perhaps you've never heard of or engaged at all. So this episode of Ideas Have Consequences, we're discussing Russell Kirk's Ex Tenebris, Out of Darkness. It's a little short story, and actually it's a ghost story, but not a horror story. Russell Kirk was a man of faith, and he's often thought of, rightly, as one of the founding fathers of American conservatism. And in this particular story, published in 1957, Kirk is explaining, he's demonstrating the flesh and blood reality, the consequences of socialist thinking. So pay attention as I explain the importance of, the profundity of a little short story. And when we're done with this, even though you haven't read it, most of you, I'm sure, haven't read it, you'll be able to follow along with the discussion. And then later, you may want to go get it. You can find it online for free, Ex Tenebris by Russell Kirk, or you can order the little booklet. Let me give you just a little bit of background to myself and to this particular reading. I'm assuming, of course, that you're all people who subscribe to Ideas Have Consequences. I used to teach literature. I taught specifically Russian literature, some English literature for many years. I love literature, and I love literature from the standpoint of how it shapes ideas or it helps us to understand them, how it expresses them. And for me, it's fun teaching literature because sometimes people will read something like this, and I'll just use my wife as an example. Lori, I remember when I first assigned this, I remember her, after she read it, she said, I have no idea it was interesting, but I have no idea where you're going to go with this. And after I was done, she said, oh, wow. I did not see that coming, and that's not what I got out of the story. And so I'm hoping that as we go along, I will assign to you a variety of things to read. And this will be among the most Christian of them that I do assign. Russell Kirk was a believer. He's known as, one of the fathers of American conservatism, and for a very good reason. And he's telling us a story here, not simply for the purpose of entertaining us. There are those who tell stories just to entertain. But Russell Kirk was someone like C.S. Lewis who wanted to convey something bigger than just that. So for him, entertainment was a vehicle to get across to his audience something bigger and more important to him, as opposed to, say, a dime store novel. Not that any of them are a dime anymore, but you get my point. It's just there. It's just a pot boiler. It's just meant to entertain you, and that's it. That's not the case for Russell Kirk. This particular story was published, again, Ex Tenebris, Out of Darkness. It was published in 1957. It is quite brief. And the book club, as we do this, we will, when we can, we will send you links, either where you can purchase the books, or maybe if the book is online. In this case, I just happened to discover last week that it's at the Russell Kirk Center, online, and you can read it there. It doesn't contain the introduction the little book does that, you can read or not read. But anyway, we will try to do that for you. And the idea of the book club is that when we do something like a YouTube Live, if you've ever participated in our YouTube Live events, there might be 1,500 people in a YouTube Live. And the result of that is that, we have a team of guys who will sift through comments and questions and then relay them to me. If you've ever watched and they're sitting off camera and they will tell me someone asked a question, or they'll put it on the screen in front of me so that I can see what's being asked. But the reality is we can't really engage you in any kind of meaningful way. If you're a member of the Posse and thus the book club, you're part of the community. So the idea is that I'm able to see your faces as I do now, at least some of you, and engage with you at a more personal level and hear your comments and questions. So that's the idea behind it. I love teaching literature. Just know that when I assign something to you, be patient for when the time comes that I actually teach it, because there may be instances, and tonight might be one of them. Someone in the 10 a.m. group said this. They said, now I want to go back and reread it. So, there may be things that once we've discussed it, you want to go look at it afresh. So again, we're looking at how ideas shape the culture, how they shape our world. And in this particular one, let me begin by saying this. And again, for others who are continually coming in, we are going to be using this episode of this instance of the book club as an episode of Ideas Have Consequences. So if you don't want to be seen or you don't want to be heard, then make sure you keep your camera off and you don't comment. We won't typically do that, but in this instance, we're going to do that. So I want you to tell me, just first of all, just your reactions to reading it. And bear in mind, I didn't write it, so it doesn't hurt my feelings if you didn't like it. So what are some of your initial thoughts?
I thought that the vicar was very Jacob Marley. Like maybe it was just the time of year, but I thought it had a very Dickens-esque feel to it. I thought, as soon as I read his character, it just reminded me of looking for penance.
Yeah. So again, for those who might not have read it, and typically with a book group, this is what I do. I usually say to a book group when I'm teaching them, love to have you come, but if you didn't do the reading, you're not allowed to make comments and dominate the conversation. Everybody's been in that type of Bible study, where, somebody shows up and they just dominate the conversation, very opinionated, but they've not bothered to read it. So you don't have to have read it to to be a part of the book club. You can just listen to the conversations, but the comments are better if people have actually read it. And Marna's comment is a very good one. So in this case, she's talking about a character, and his name is Hargreaves, who obviously has come back from the dead, and he's come from hell. He's come from the north side of the church that is described here. In the church, on that side of the church, who's on that side of the church? Well, that's where all the murderers, that's where all the people who've committed egregious sins, they're buried in the graveyard on that side of the church. And most of us today don't attend churches where there is actually a graveyard. They've been removed from sight. We don't think of that, but there was a time where the church was the center of everyone's life. It was the place where you would be, would receive baptism or christening. It was where you might be married. It was the place where your funeral might be performed. I mean, all the major things in your life taking place in the church itself. And then you just be buried straight outside in the church graveyard. Now we don't do that, but we're going to come back to that theme in just a little bit. But on the north side of the church is where all of these, these people who are damned, are buried. And then on the south side of the church is where all the nice people, the ones who are going to heaven are. And that side of the church is much nicer. It's much more pleasant. And then the north side of the church is described as very cold and, kind of forbidding and unpleasant. As we go through life, the years bring us wisdom, experience, and memories we hold dear. Yet with age, our health often faces new challenges. It's a natural part of life, but it's crucial to address these changes with the right care and attention. For me, one of the ways to stay sharp is to supplement. I've been using Liver Health Formula, and I recommend you try it for yourself to see the results that it can bring. And right now, I think is the time to start taking care of your liver, because there is a silent epidemic affecting 100 million Americans. 1 in 3 Americans suffer from an overworked and sluggish liver. It affects our weight, energy levels, clear thinking and productivity, and even sleep. Our livers get bombed every day with GMOs, microplastics, toxins, and all of the stuff that you might not even know about. Liver Health Formula can support your liver to minimize the impacts of all of this. It is a premium supplement designed with 11 clinically proven botanicals to support and detoxify your liver, helping you feel revitalized and ready to conquer each day. Just listen to Mr. Harrington's testimonial, who shared his transformative journey. At first, I was skeptical, but the health improvement has been nothing but amazing. The tired, foggy feeling I've had is gone. I have more energy for a longer duration. Also, the service and delivery is always prompt. Of course, results are not typical, thus you have to see for yourself. There's an exclusive deal for my audience. Head to getliverhelp.com/Larry. And as a special offer, you'll get a free 1-month supply of nano-powered omega-3s with your order. That's getliverhelp.com/Larry. But yes, that's Hargreaves. Jacob Marley is a great comparison. Other reactions to it? Did you like it?
Sure. Larry, when I first went through this, not trying to dig deep into it, I think what really captured me was just his descriptions. The first one that I pointed out was the way that he described her chin, that it went, he described her nose, that it went nearly to his chin. And there were so many other really rich descriptions that were throughout. So he was really trying to paint a picture that you could almost form in your mind's eye. That you could form in your mind's eye what the houses looked like, and that they were decrepit. And at one point, this neighborhood was a quaint little neighborhood, but now it's just gone in disrepair. So those are the
well
things,
written.
Yeah, those things that kind of capture my attention and keep my interest. And then as you get to the vicar, there were very, very acute descriptions of him as well that just really helped you paint a picture in your mind's eye of what's really going on in this neighborhood.
In the last sound cottage lives Mrs. Oliver, an ancient little woman with a nose that very nearly meets her chin. It's an interesting description. Other reactions to the reading? Verena.
Yeah. So I don't know if I read too much into a lot, but I was thinking immediately of Stalin and taking away land, kulaks. And I think it's from Hegel, Aufheben of the culture by erasing the past. So I'm from East Germany, so born and raised there.
Okay.
So that's maybe why I read more of just the naming of Gorsk. Like I immediately thought of a Polish city, Gorsk, where the Nazis invaded and took the land away from the people and then resettled the Germans. So I had a lot of those socialist realism and architecture, like all those things.
Spot on, Verena. Actually, you're not reading anything into it. That's what Kirk is trying to communicate. And that brings me to another question, which is this. What do you think the overall theme of this story is? Now, I've told you that, yes, he does want to entertain you, and he does. I personally find it very entertaining. It's a fun little short story. And today, when we think of a ghost story, we think of horror, actually. This is an old school ghost story where it sets a kind of mood, but it's not grotesque. It's setting a mood. And what do you think he's trying to communicate? What does he want us to know? Pardon me?
The road to serfdom.
Yeah. Well, there we go. The road to serfdom is paved with what? Bad architecture. It's paved with 15-minute cities, and that's what Gorst is. Gorst is the 1950s version of what they're trying to accomplish today. But a primary theme in here is this: there are a few that we're gonna tease out, but one is that human beings are not strictly material. We have souls. We have needs that go beyond material needs. Now, when I wrote this book, I don't remember if I probably had read Ex Tenebris before I wrote this book, but this particular book right here, The Grace Effect, which was my first book, and if this is the book that the New York Times and everybody were hailing, but this is the one that has my heart. And it is the story of how my wife and I went through the process of adopting a little girl from Ukraine. And while Ukraine in 2009, which was when we were adopting her, was no longer, a Soviet satellite, it was still running off of the orphanages, and Sasha was abandoned at birth and raised in 3 different Ukrainian orphanages. They were all running off of Soviet ideas, communist ideas, socialist ideas. And one of the things I finally put my finger on in Eastern Europe, and Verena can testify to this. I've spent a lot of time in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe and the old Soviet Union. Is those ideas saw human beings as raw material for the building of a socialist state. That's all you were. There was no individual. There's only the collective. And you'll notice that Russell Kirk refers to the collective when he's talking about S.G.W. Barner, one of our characters here who represents a socialist bureaucrat. And Barner is the guy who's thinking in terms of the collective. And Mrs. Oliver, who lives in her village, by herself, she's an individual. And when the ghost, the Parsons, is summoned from hell on her behalf, he's there to plead not for the collective, but for the individual. And this is one of the things that sets apart socialism from what has traditionally been a very American view. For instance, Madison and the Federalist Papers, which of course led ultimately to the creation of the Constitution of the United States, he argued for the importance of the individual when he talked about something called the tyranny of the majority. So in other words, the idea of pure democracy is a kind of tyranny. We're a republic, representative republic. And it's somewhat different because we're saying, yes, the needs of the many, they do matter, but so does the individual. We're individuals. In the socialist mindset, there are no individuals. Individuality is bourgeois. Individuality is selfish, you see. And I'm mindful of a line from one of the Star Trek movies from when I was in high school. And it's when Spock, is sliding down the glass inside the nuclear reactor. And Kirk is on the outside with his hand pressed against and together they're sliding down. And he says, "Why did you do it?" And Spock says, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few and the needs of the one." Now, in a sense, it sounds very noble. And in that particular moment, it was, because Spock was sacrificing his life to save the ship. But that's a statement that needs, an asterisk and then some explanatory notes down below, because the needs of the many do not always outweigh the needs of the few and the needs of the one. And that's part of what Kirk wants to communicate here. And in stressing the fact that we are both bodily and physical beings, we have a foot in both worlds, where one foot is firmly planted in a material world and the other foot is planted in a spiritual world. Kirk is trying to drive home to you that the socialist mindset has no regard for not only for individuality, but for the needs of the soul. And the needs of the soul are very real. And something that Verena just said is so relevant to this. How many of you, other than Verena and myself, how many of you have ever been in Eastern Europe? Where have you been, Jeff?
I'm clicking the wrong mute button. Like you, I adopted daughters from Ukraine. So
okay.
In 2000, I was actually in St. Petersburg in 2000, Ukraine in 2002, and then again in 2011. So
okay, who else? Did I see Young in the top left there? Have you been in Eastern Europe? Does somebody else raise their hand? Has anybody else been in Eastern Europe? No. Okay. Well, to be clear, one of the things you'll immediately notice is both the Stalinist and especially the Khrushchev era architecture, which is dehumanizing. And it has a way, it's kind of soul crushing. There's something about it that's hard to explain if you've not experienced it, but it's straight out of, 1984, Brave New World. It meets a need. You go in to meet with the adoption inspector, for instance, in Odessa, Ukraine. It's a big soulless office. It does shelter those within from the elements outside, but there's no aesthetic value to it at all. It's just concrete and metal and glass. That's just all it is. And as some of you will know, I was recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Mexico City, and I was being given a tour at the University of Mexico, which is the largest institution there. And I was immediately feeling I was enjoying the tour. I was enjoying the companion. So that wasn't it. But as I was walking around, I was starting to feel kind of, I don't know, something I didn't like. And I finally put my finger on it. It was the architecture. And I asked my guide, I said, this stuff here was built, when socialism was all the rage here, wasn't it? And he said, yep, it sure was. This was built in the, 40s and 50s. And their library is this giant concrete, largely windowless, in brick structure. And you go inside of it and there's no natural light and there's no aesthetic value and there are no plants or trees outside. It's just, it looks like a World War I battlefield almost, that everything around it is leveled. That they came in, it's like some of the newer residential areas that you see often being constructed where when they come in, just for ease of building things, they just knock down all trees. It doesn't matter if they're 50 years old or 100 years old, they just annihilate them all and then pop up, these cookie cutter houses. And you're thinking, oh, wow, if they could have left that water oak there, that would have been very nice, or something like that. A tire swing could have gone in that tree, but they just don't care. And there's something about that kind of architecture that when you're around it, it creates a particular mood in you. And that's kind of the idea. That is the idea. I mean, it's intentional. It's to make you feel small and insignificant. And those things, those desires are all just petty bourgeois desires. So he's trying to communicate the importance of such things. Another thing that he's trying to communicate is the importance of place. The importance of place. I travel an awful lot. And in my travels, sometimes now, first of all, I should say that it's very interesting. My wife and I come from very different backgrounds. She was born and raised in the same house her whole life, which to me is just inconceivable because I was a child of the military. So I was moving. I lived everywhere with a prefix Fort. I just say, where'd you live? Fort, fill in the blank. Fort Campbell, Fort Lewis, Fort Benning, Fort Gordon. I was at all of them. And you're there briefly and then you move on, somewhere else. And that was just kind of the nature of our life. And one of the things that my mother tried to do is because so much of our world was dominated by the government, which mass produces like IKEA, just everything is the same. Everybody has the same chair and the same desk and the blankets, the army blankets of my youth. My brother and I both had, the army blankets, which were, olive drab, and they're itchy. They're really, really itchy. I guess they're wool. And little by little, my mother begins to sort of beautify the house. And she decided, we're not going to do government housing anymore. That is to say, live on base. We're going to live off base. And suddenly it was like a cool breeze, blew through all of our lives because suddenly you don't have that government gray chair and the olive drab. Do you understand what I'm talking about? It's a thing that affects you at a subconscious level, but is very real. And that's not to say the United States government at the time was socialist. It's just simply to say that they produce things with a purely practical end in mind. There was no beauty that was involved in that. And we have need for those kinds of things. We really do. And so the importance of place matters. And for my wife, we can go around her hometown and she can associate memories with all kinds of places in that town. And when we were there recently, because her father died earlier this year, and so I was back personally. She goes back more often than I do, but I was there for the first time in many years. And we're sitting outside in the car, and she said, "Do you know what happened right there?" And she said, "That's where you kissed me for the first time." Right there. She said, I remember vividly that spot right there. I was waiting. Is he going to? And all, memories, sweet memories, sometimes they're sad memories, but that are associated with different places. And I find that even for myself, a guy who's used to always kind of being on the move, the rolling stone that gathers no moss, I discover that when I'm traveling a lot, I can start to feel a little loss of identity. Does anybody know what I mean by that? Verena, were you going to say something?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I can start to feel a little loss of identity. And what I mean by that is our surroundings, our place, they kind of tell us who they are, don't they? They remind us of who they are. And you don't have to have been raised in a particular place for that to be true, but they do affect, because when we're at home, we have a sense of who we are and our place within the order of everything, right? So we see the corner shop where we go, his son and I went to high school together, and that spot over there, that's where that's that time I broke my ankle, that happened right over there. And that's the house where, I asked that girl out to the prom, over there, and on and on, just things like that. They remind us of who we are, but we also have familiarity with the topography. When I'm in the American South, which is really my home, everything's quite familiar to me. As I sit right here, I know what grass feels like after a summer rain, and I take my shoes off and I walk through the grass, and I know what the pines smell like after a summer rain. I know what the wisteria smells like in the spring. I know the sound of the birds, the familiar sights and sounds and smells, and all those things help to give me a sense of identity. And this is part of what he's talking about here. Is Barner is a guy that all he does is he sees maps. You recall that she says he worships his maps. But Kirk is driving home the importance of place. Verena.
Yeah, so I was back in Germany this year for the first time in 5 years. And although I was raised in one of those ugly socialist blocks, everything uniform, you could hear your neighbors. There was no privacy whatsoever. And I remember we weren't allowed to watch Western TV. And then when the series Dallas, when that was on, and also, you couldn't stop the waves, right, from West Germany. And then you could hear, in the house, you could hear from every freaking apartment, you could hear the music from Dallas. So everybody
weren't allowed to watch it, but
I can hear it right now, yeah.
And so I walked, those places, and there was this tender connection to my youth. But now I've lived here in America for 10 years, and I got converted here. So now there's this feeling back there of a disconnect. Yes.
Oppression? Is oppression too strong a word?
No, absolutely. They're lost. They're lost. There's no God. And they don't even know it. There's this weird calm oppression, and I don't think they can describe it. And now I live here, and why I don't have the connection so much to, especially Dallas. I like it here, but it's kind of ugly when you know European architecture.
Sure.
But having a home, I never thought I have my own home with my husband, and that's so precious, like private property, where I learned like that's the worst. That's from the enemy. And for me, it's like especially your own home, that like the cottage of Mrs. Oliver, which is hers. Maybe she's a little isolated. Maybe she doesn't have those connections, but that is
She's okay with it.
hers. And she's
okay with it. If she wished somebody lived a little closer. And of course, at the end of the story, we're learning that other people are going to start populating those.
First, when you were talking about the architecture in Eastern Europe, I think what's even worse is that there's beautiful architecture in St. Petersburg. There's beautiful architecture in Odessa. And yet they treat it the same way they do those administrative buildings. There's one door you can go in and out of, and they don't take care of it. It's, when you go in, it's musty, dusty. It's not beautiful. And then the second comment, when you're talking about places, I even found that moving down here from the Midwest, moving down to the South, I did feel out of place, and it was unusual because just a quick example, up in the North, you never would talk about church. Here, that's the second question out of everybody's mouth. What church do you go to? So,
that is the South. That is for sure. That is the South. And it's an acceptable question here. Well, he is definitely driving home the importance of place. And you don't have to have lived in a place all your life to start, to put down roots and to nest and to feel like it's yours, and where you feel a sense of identity and community with the people who are there, who help give you that sense of identity. But for me, say I'm abroad in China, or I'm in Vietnam, or I'm somewhere, in the jungles of South America, I can start feeling a little out of place. I can start feeling a little bit like I'm losing some connection, and with it, some kind of identity that goes along with it, which is significant. And again, that's because we have souls. We have souls. Our souls we have needs that go beyond just the way you treat a plant. And the way that S.G.W. Barner wants to treat Mrs. Oliver and everyone is the way you would treat a plant. And this is the way I described the way they were treating the children in the orphanages in Ukraine, is that a plant, you just, you give it water, a little food, and some sunlight, and poof, it grows. There you go. That's all it needs. And human beings are more than just their material wants, their material needs, rather. We have needs that go well beyond that. And Lori, my wife, she jokes that if you put me, she I have a real need for beauty. And she says, if you put Larry in a windowless office, he'll produce nothing. If you get him lots of sunlight and put him with his laptop in a place of beauty, he'll produce something, all day long. And it's true. It feeds my soul. It has a real effect on my soul in ways that are hard to describe. There's a woman that I think I've mentioned on Ideas Have Consequences before. Actually, she should be in here, but every time we visit her home, she has a way of ministering to my soul. It's hard for me to explain that, but it has to do with the warmth in which she welcomes me into her home. She knows what I like to eat, and she always seems to magically have it available. And just the warmth of her hospitality and the way that she takes seriously the beauty of her home. She's a very gifted homemaker. And when I sit in her kitchen by the fireplace and sip a cup of, hot cocoa or something, at Christmas while I'm chatting with her as she's working in the kitchen, was one of my favorite things to do. There's something in that that's kind of beautiful. And again, it goes beyond the cocoa, and it goes beyond the fire. It has to do with a sort of a need that we all have. And the socialists don't care about this. Now, Barner is a guy, he is described as one of these government bureaucrats. He's obviously a socialist. And what bothers him is that Mrs. Oliver is like a colored pin on his map. All the other colored pins have been moved to Gorst. And what Verena says is absolutely true. That is a name that sounds just like a Soviet name for a new town, not one that, that's grown up over the course of, centuries, but a new socialist, enlightened, community, that they would give that kind of inhuman kind of name to it. And all the other pins rather, have been moved over to Gorse, but there she sits. And it annoys him. And what annoys him even more is that every time he sees her, at first he thinks, well, no big deal. She's so ancient, she won't live long. But every time he sees her, she seems to be getting stronger. And Kirk is letting us know that something about coming back from India. She's been away for a very long time, so long that Sir Gerald, who's in his 60s, doesn't have any memory of her. He knows the name, but he doesn't know her. So she's very ancient. She must have left even before he was born, or at least before he had memory of such things. And now she's come back, but being amidst all the familiarity of the countryside, the roses, and training them, as it were, to climb the wall of her cottage, and her hands in the soil. And she discovers that the oven within this dilapidated little cottage is really quite good. And she's making, fresh bread. You can almost smell it the way he's described it. It's a very homey kind of feel. And this woman seems to be sort of reviving. We're told that she now has very rosy cheeks, and she's going for long walks. And in spite of her age, she seems to be doing quite well. And though she gets a little bit lonely, she's satisfied to stay there. And she says she will not go to Gorse because Gorse is ugly. It's ugly and it's soulless, and she doesn't want to be a part of it. Do you realize that I recently did some research on this for one of the Ideas Have Consequences episode, that up until 1920, the population of the United States was evenly split, or was majority rather. Up to 1920, it was majority rural. The majority of Americans lived in rural places. In 1920, that started to tilt in the other direction, so that now only 14% of Americans live in rural places. Now, that to me is pretty significant, and it's how we end up with such condescending terms as flyover states. You see, a driving personality trait of guys like Barnard, this socialist, is arrogance. It's arrogance. Barnard is the kind of guy that if he lived today, he'd go to the World Economic Forum. He would be a member. He'd have a hat that said WEF, on it, and this kind of thing. He's the kind of guy that I sit with and that Verena grew up with. They have a way of talking that's kind of hard for me to describe, but Russell Kirk kind of captures it in so far as they talk about where towards the end here, this is exactly the kind of language that they will use. Oh, well, anyway, he talks about how he's speaking. Oh, here it is. Mr. S.G.W. Barnard sat in a study amusing himself by drawing up plans for a model collective agricultural unit. I mean, doesn't that sound nice to live in? A collective agricultural unit. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, there was something called collectivism in Russia, where they forcibly moved people from villages into collective farms, which was a complete disaster, and they murdered millions in the process in order to do it. Machine gunned whole villages of people who refused to move. And but when you go to the WEF, they talk like this: model collective agricultural units. And so not only are the things they create dehumanizing, but even the language they use has a way of being dehumanizing. So he's really irritated, and he wants to get her off the land because she's that annoying needle on the map that he just can't get out of the way. And in order to make his map look beautiful the way he wants to, she's got to be moved. So when he gets a call, well, let me back up from that first. One of the more interesting little comments, and it's just a almost a throwaway comment, is that Sir Gerald, when he's having dinner with his wife, he says, I had an interesting conversation today with Mrs. Oliver, and I'm afraid she might be losing it. So don't say anything to anybody about this. But she said today she had a vicar come for a visit. She had tea with him. And his wife says, "You mean like the vicar from Gorse?" And she goes, "No." He says, No. That guy wouldn't even bother to come down here, and he's so soft. He does not fit the description of the guy she was describing. And he uses this phrase. He says this, and you know how frail, what a frail reed Vicar Harris is. While this fellow seems to have been a strapping parson of the old breed. Now, that resonates with me in a couple of ways. Again, growing up in the military as I did, my father being a member of the Special Forces, I can recall that there were very few pastors that my father felt any kind of a connection with. And it wasn't because he mistreated them or anything like that, but I think he just felt like he couldn't relate to them because they were frequently fit more of the description of Harris, who was a frail reed, meaning that we are producing these days, and I want to be very clear that I'm not condemning all seminary products or all pastors. By no means am I doing that. However, in reflection of our current Western culture, seminaries are producing an awful lot of beta male pastors, very soft sorts who feel like they've gone straight from, say, Christian school to Christian college to seminary and straight into a church without any real life experience. Does this resonate with you? And I remember the pastor that eventually had real impact on my dad's thinking. He was a minister of the old breed. He was a man who had a real impact on my own life when I was very young, when I was like 12, 13, that sort of thing. He was the reason I would ultimately meet my wife, and he married the two of us. But he would go to South Dakota pheasant hunting, and when I was 14, he took me with him, and I eventually met her there. But he was an interesting guy. He was already quite elderly, had gnarled hands from working the railroad, and he had not graduated from high school because he had to go to work during the Great Depression. And so he got his GED, and he eventually went to seminary on a GI Bill. And so this was a guy who'd come over, and he would sit down with my dad, and they'd have coffee together. And there was no dirty joke my father couldn't tell that he couldn't match with one of his own. And the point isn't that you need to be you need a vicar who could tell dirty jokes. Rather, my point is that he was a man with real world experiences. And he was the sort of guy that I think my father felt like, he's not so fragile, I'm going to break him. And he's the sort of guy that I can talk to about real life and real experiences in a way that won't shock him. Whereas I feel that young fella who comes around and tries to share the gospel with me, I got to be real gentle with him because I'm afraid he's been so sheltered from the world, he doesn't actually know about actual sin. Does that make sense? And so here you have this parson who's being described like that. And there are other writings that refer to these, the old school kind of vicar or pastor. And this particular guy liked sinners in the hands of an angry God. I mean, he was somebody who liked to preach judgment and so forth. Guys, it's been great to see you. I've enjoyed the book club. I hope you have too. I've enjoyed engaging with you at a personal level. I look forward to doing more of that. And we're going to build this community up. And one of the reasons we really want to do this is because we're getting throttled on Twitter. Excuse me, not on Twitter. Well, I'm getting some of that on Twitter, but on YouTube hugely. The first, I don't know, several months of Ideas Have Consequences, we were 400, 500, 600,000 views per episode, and then they just stopped doing it. And Lawrence and I joke about this on the other show that I do, which is WTF, because we're always commenting, he'll say something like, I'm sick of the penis chopping crowd. And I go, boom, we're going to get suppressed for that right there. And then I'll come back and say something about pedophiles. And I go, boom, we're going to get suppressed for that. They are choking us on there. But you see, the more people we get to join the Posse, we can circumvent that, because you see a lot of people are complaining that they're not getting notifications from YouTube when we post an episode. Well, see, if we have your email address, we can ping you. We can let you know. We can send you directly an episode. We can send you articles. We can do all that stuff. And we can make people aware of this. So share with other people. Let's grow the Posse, and let's do some good. Great to see y'all.